So during this module, we're going to talk about the characteristics of the program, talk about the differences between your responsibilities, the federal highway responsibilities. We're going to talk about the current transportation legislation. I don't know how many of you follow ongoing politics and all things. Yeah, I don't expect. If you don't live inside what they call the Beltway, so around the Washington, D.C. area, most people have no clue what's going on. And you know what? I live in that area, and I still prefer not to know what's going on half the time. We're going to talk about the difference between eligible and allowable. This is a big passion of mine, so we're going to talk about that a lot. And then identifying the major activities in the federal aid highway program. So first, the characteristics of the federal aid highway program. In 1916, 1921, there were two acts that established the federal aid highway program. Really, these acts were established to bring states together. It was not unusual at that time to have a state build a road all the way to its border and then stop. It was done. So, you know, you might have go to your border and then you don't know where you're going to go. There's suddenly a mountain somewhere and you're done. So this was why it was put together, or the 1916 and 1921 road acts is what they were called, were established. The federal aid highway program, as Bob mentioned, is federally assisted, state administered. Who can tell me what that means? Do you remember from this morning? Who has the responsibility for executing the program? ODOT, that's right, you guys do. You have to do all the hard work. We're just here looking pretty and answering questions when it happens. So, so it requires you to have a state agency, obviously, ODOT you have. There's funding tied to specific categories of roads, and we're going to get into that in the next few slides, looking at everything from a major artery down to a local rural road. We're going to talk about the maintenance. There, with some exceptions, maintenance is on the state. We'll get into that. Matching requirements. Bob was talking this morning about federal share, and I believe, what is your sliding scale here? We'll get into that as well. But what percentage sliding scale do you have? You don't use sliding scale? Okay. All right, we'll get that. And then contract authority. Contract authority is very interesting. When I first came into federal highway, we talked about contract authority and obligation limitation. We're going to go into more of those in more detail, but it didn't make any sense to me. So contract authority is the authority that's given to us by Congress under our acts, our legislative authority, that allows us to operate without appropriation. So the federal government in general is tied to, every year you hear them talk about the Congress has to pass the budget. Congress has to pass the budget. We don't have a budget. We're under continuing resolution. Last year, you saw the federal government completely shut down. Not completely, but a large portion of the federal government shut down because there wasn't a passing of appropriation. Federal highway has what's called contract authority. We are authorized under law, separate from the Appropriations Act. Right now, can anybody tell me what we're operating under right now? FAST Act is what we're currently operating under. Yeah, for another 6 months, and we'll talk about that too. But we have the FAST Act that gives us the authority to be in operation even though the federal government isn't there. It has to be tied, the unique part is it has to be tied to a trust fund. And we're going to get into that too, the Federal Highway Trust Fund. So contract authority is unique to the federal aid highway program. So talking about functional classifications, who deals with classifications? I heard a lot with planning and asset management, performance management, HPMS. So does somebody want to help me with this? Your classifications? You got it. I do have them, you're right. So the functional classifications, as you can see, you're now, I will tell you, I manage money for the government. I am not smarter than a 5th grader. So your x-axis, my y-axis. So you're going up, your vertical axis. You're increasing mobility, that's your higher functioning classification, your freeways, and then it works its way down to the local streets and minor collectors, local streets, and so forth. This is important because when we talk about allowability and eligibility, the different types of funding you have can be used on different types of roadways. Typically, the lower the mobility kind of down towards the local street, that's not eligible for federal aid programs, with some exceptions. Bridges in particular, off-system bridges, there are some designations and set-asides out of the funding that can be used for those bridges. But as you get into, you know, Bob's Dirt Road that takes him to his home, that isn't typically eligible for a federal aid highway program. Does that make sense with my very confused X and Y axis? It's also why my daughter has a math tutor, and it's not to me. But the higher the designation, the more use of the federal funds, and it's really based on access. The higher the road mobility, typically has also more access points, really focusing on keeping the public mobile. We're going to get into this. So even though the funds can be used on the road, they have to be allowable according to the cost principles. We'll get into cost principles tomorrow in great detail. It's always a rousing conversation when you talk about what eligible costs are and not. So that'll be fun. But they're defined in 2 CFR 200 subpart E. So here are our definitions. Bob likes definitions, and I think they're so important. So I'm really glad we're doing this. And we're going to get into alphabet soup in a few minutes. So if there's anything you don't understand, please raise your hand, let me know. But federal aid highway, as I mentioned, generally all routes except rural minor collectors or local roads. And the national highway system, it's interstate system and a number of designated principal urban and rural arterials. That's a lot. In 1990, when these were first established, there was about 168,000 miles of roads. In 2012, when MAP 21 was launched or issued, that was the legislative authority before FAST Act, we actually enhanced the NHA National Highway System, and there's now 220,000 miles of roads. So here is a great graphic showing the kind of the eligibility of the funding. So you can see actually 76% of the roads throughout the United States generally aren't eligible for our funding. Again, it depends. There's some exceptions to the rule. There's always exceptions to rules, but generally ineligible. The interstate system is actually only 1% of what is eligible, and then you've got kind of other federal aid highways. Who can tell me what an other federal aid highway might be? State highway. Something that's connecting it through. Yeah. So 24% of the 4 million public roads are eligible. Oh, I should back up. Safety funds, I want to talk about that too. Safety funds, those are the exception to the rule in a lot of ways. They can be used on pretty much any public road. We're going to get into the soup there with the safety funds, but they are eligible to be used on anything. So federal responsibilities. These are kind of this is a breakdown of what our job is in administering the federal aid program. So federal highways responsibilities. As Bob said, we review and approve the state projects. You can't move forward without authorization. If you do, you may not be eligible to claim those expenses. It's our responsibility to develop regulations and guidance. So we're going to get into legislative aspects and elements in the next module, but it's our job to develop those regulations and guidance. Who can tell me one of the most recent ones? Who's living it? It came out within the last year or two. Actually, this year was your first year of reporting. Last year was. All the performance metrics, performance management, asset management plans, payment management plans, all those, that was a regulation that we put out. You're welcome. It was so much fun. Oh my goodness, 4 years of dealing with lawyers. My colleagues were ready to pull their hair out. So we also, I love this word, promulgate standards. Who's familiar with MUTCD? Yeah, so that's the responsibility of the Federal Highway Administration. Provide technical assistance, the training you're in today, as Bob was saying, other classes that we have, that's our responsibility. Distributing lines of credit, this is really important. On October 1st of every year, fiscal year, you get a notice of apportionment. It means that's telling you how much money you're going to have throughout the year. You may not get it all up front. Depends on if we have a continuing resolution or if we have full funding. But you know at the beginning of the year how much money your state is going to get. So that's just then line of credit. And then I heard somebody say, what happens after we submit an invoice and approve an invoice? It's our responsibility to make sure we're paying you back for your eligible expenses. Keyword there being eligible. So the Federal Highway Administration, we have, as you know, an office in every state. In the division offices, we have 3 federal land offices that oversee the federal lands in a given region, so western, central, eastern. We have headquarters in Washington, D.C. That's where I'm out of. And then our Florida division oversees the territories, Guam, Mariana Islands, and Puerto Rico. All right, so your responsibilities. You only have 2 responsibilities, but your responsibilities are probably the largest. You get to conceive, plan, design, initiate, and construct the projects, which is the really cool part. But then you get to maintain and operate the highways, which, you know, depends on what field you're working in, can also be really cool. But you have the heaviest lift. The responsibility for the program really falls on you. That's why we say it's Federal Highway Assisted State Administered Program. The legislative process. As I was talking about, the legislative process, we have our acts that we're going to walk through in a couple of slides. But we start with Congress. They tell us what we can do. They authorize the funding. They tell us how we're going to distribute the funding. Then we obligate the funding from there and expend ultimately at the end. Who can tell me, so if we're missing a whiteboard, but if there were a whiteboard, you'd get to see my artwork. I'm not smarter than a 5th grader, and I did not pass art either. But I would draw an umbrella. So if you think of a big umbrella, you got the Federal Aid Highway Program at the top. Who can tell me what your types of funding are underneath? Any ideas? What do you work with? NHPP. It's good. I heard back over here. Somebody's STBG. I told you we were headed into alphabet soup, didn't I? That's where we're going. NHPP, STBG, HSIP, CMAC, yep. Freight. Somebody said NHPP. We got that one back there. Do I have planners in the room? PL funds, yep. I heard research. Research is interesting. We'll get to that in a second. Research is not one of your sources of funding. I'm missing one. We got STBG and HPP. Freight, we got CMAC, safety, planning. Nope, that's it. That's all of them, right? We got 6 of them. Yep, all right. So all those funds fall under an umbrella of the Federal Aid Highway Program. The Authorization Act tells us what those funding types are going to be. So right now we have the NHPP, STBG, like we just mentioned. We have a new authorization coming. We could have different funding under that. Each authorization designates what the funding is going to be. It also sets the specific requirements. We're going to get into the types. When we talk about specific requirements, NHPP is your largest funding source, but it is restricted to only National Highway System roads. You can't use it for anything off that. So it's the largest pot of money, but it's also got restrictions on it, whereas STBG is your most flexible source of funding. That's all defined in the Authorization Act. The Authorization Act authorizes the funds. It's your line of credit like we talked about. The beginning of fiscal year, it tells us how much we're going to send to each state in apportionment, and then how you're going to be able to use it. It gives us the definition of the fund characteristics. We were talking about matching requirements. So does anybody know what your matching requirements are for the type of funding you use? What's that? It's okay. There are no wrong answers in here. So don't worry about that. Typically 80-20. 80-20 depends on what you're doing, but the standard is about 80-20. I was asking about sliding scale because there is an option, some states have sliding scale where it's accommodating for federal lands in that state. I think Nevada is 95% Yeah, so they only have 5% matching requirement. But typically 80-20, ER is an exception, emergency relief funds. First 180 days after an event, it's 100% federal share. After that, it goes to the 80-20. Some other, I think so, some of the safety. So the point here being the Authorization Act defines what those requirements are. It's really important as you administer your program, you understand as you're planning, as you're executing your project, you understand what the specific requirements and eligible activities are for those. As I mentioned, NHPP has a set focus area. A lot of times you also get, does anybody work with EDC? Every day counts? Back there? Yep. So that funding is actually coming to you as part of the headquarters research budget. So we're designated under law, same thing as you guys, under authorization, a certain amount of research funding and technology deployment. That comes with an 80-20 match. It also comes with a very specific requirement of what you're going to use the money on. If you use your money, if you say you're going to do a project on warm mix asphalt, that funding is only good on a project with warm mix asphalt. It can't be used for anything else. So eligibility activities are very important. The Authorization Act covers multiple years. Right now we're under a 5-year authorization. I heard the next one they're proposing is 10 years, so that we're not doing this every few years. They're giving themselves a little bit longer. Whether that happens or not, I don't know. Two authorizations ago, Safety Lou actually ended up being, almost a 12-year, because we had the original 6 and then they kept extending it. It felt like we were under Safety Lou forever. So it just depends on what they're doing.
I just wanted to add, the lady there had mentioned on interstates, the federal share is 90-10.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so it's 80-20 standard, and then if it's an interstate project, it's 90-10. So I just wanted to make sure that I heard that and that's correct.
Thank you for clarifying. Appreciate that. All right, so legislative process. This is where we are today. As I said, if you're outside the Beltway, you may not be as familiar. Inside the Beltway, they're talking about this all the time. But it starts with the hearings on the House side and the Senate side. They both come up with their grand plans of what they think the transportation bill should look like. Senators from various states or congresspeople, they're fighting for their activities that they want in their state, and they're putting the plans together. It goes through their individual subcommittees down to their committee. So you've got essentially a small working group, and then it goes down to the subcommittee and then the committee. They look at it. They look at the House bill. They look at the Senate bill. They look to see, are there any differences? If there are differences, then they kind of go back, looking, taking into consideration what they all said, and start again until they come to the point where they have no differences, and then they can move it forward for conference committee. And I believe that's the part where we're headed into now. If there are differences in the conference committee, they keep working through to floor action. If there's no differences, if they have one bill, both the House and the Senate agree to it, it goes to the president for approval. Can anybody tell me if a president has ever vetoed a transportation bill? Trivia. But if I ask the question, probably yes. Yes, one president did. Ronald Reagan vetoed a transportation bill because there were too many earmarks. He didn't like how many earmarks there were in there. So that was a fun fact. If the president's in agreement, he says, yes, we're good. It goes through. We've got a transportation bill. Thank you so much. Now it becomes the hard work of Federal Highway, trying to figure out what in the world these senators and congressmen have written. Lots of glasses of wine, I think, trying to figure out what they mean. But that becomes Federal Highway, and then we execute a new program. If the president says no, it's vetoed, two things can happen. It can be the Senate could overturn it, the Senate and the House, or they go back to the beginning. So that's what we're working through right now. Here's kind of a highway picture of where we've been. As I mentioned, 1916, 1921, that's where it began, and we've worked our way through. The Equity Act, so anything that's from 1991 forward, ICE-T, T-21, Safety Lou, those acts really changed the way we do things. It provided more money to the states that contribute more money to the trust fund and moved to a formula distribution for the apportioned funds that you get every year. If Congress doesn't pass an extension, what happens? Any idea? FAST Act. But if they don't pass a replacement for the FAST Act, we have no funding and we don't come to work. So October 1, if there's not a new bill or an extension. So if Congress can't come to an agreement, they extend. That's what I was saying. Safety Lou ended up being almost 12 years because they kept extending and extending and extending. If they don't come to an agreement and there is no extension, on October 1, your federal highway partners will be, well, Louisa might still have to come to work because she's essential, but the rest of us would be furloughed until Congress puts something together. It happened to us one time. We were furloughed for 3 days, I believe, between Safety Lou and MAP 21 is when we were furloughed. So FAST Act, signed into law on December 4th, 2015. It's a 5-year act, so it's going to go to, and this is where it gets kind of crazy. It was signed in 2015, but fiscal year, it'll go through fiscal year 2020 right now. So we got 2016 to 2020, but that's how they get 5 years because of the fiscal years. $305 billion in total authorizations. You can see here that the majority of it, $226 billion, was authorized for the Federal Aid Highway Program, but not all of it is ours. We do share a little bit of money with our friends. I heard you say you get money from FTA or FRA. Okay, FRA. They get a tiny portion of the bill, of the budget. And then FMCSA, NHTSA, they get a portion too. We talked about the major programs, so now we'll go into kind of more specifics on them, of how we're funded. You got the National Highway Performance Program, NHPP, it's our alphabet soup. Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, STBG. CMAQ, do you guys have a large CMAQ program here? Not huge, but you have one? Okay, all right. I've been in a couple states where they didn't have one at all, so. The Highway Safety Improvement Program, HSIP, National Highway Freight Program, and then the Metropolitan Planning. Somebody mentioned to us earlier SPR, State Planning and Research. Who? You? Yeah, that's what you do. Okay. So a portion of each of these funds, and we'll get into this again in the future, comes from this. It's a set aside out of these larger umbrella. We talked about the umbrella. Larger programs. So the program requirements, those are defined by the law, by the authorization. It tells us, the authorization tells us how much money is going into each of the categories, how much money is going to be set aside for NHPP, how much is going to be set aside for STBG. It tells us how they're going to be distributed. Are they going to be distributed by formula? Are they going to be distributed by first in, first state giving the most money, least money? I think we had 13 different formulas under previous acts. Now we're down to one. It's going to tell you what the eligible locations are, your system. So right now we had in the last authority, we got money for a competitive highway bridge program. Did Oklahoma win any competitive highway bridge funds? I see a big yes back there. Right, so that program was defined under the legislation, and it defined specifically what types of bridges could be used for this type of funding for the competitive highway bridge. And they have to be off-system bridges in a rural area with a certain population, am I correct? Yeah, so it defines that eligible location in the system for us. It defines the eligible activities. What can the money be used on and for? As we talked about NHPP, it's your largest amount of funding, but it's also got restrictions to it. The period of availability, this is really important. Our funds aren't typically good forever. The exception to that being emergency relief. Emergency relief funds are good until Congress actually takes them back. My team oversees emergency relief. We actually have money from the early 90s that we're still monitoring, and I have 36 cents that I have to carry every year on our books because I have to keep track of that 36 cents until Congress decides to take it back. I know, I haven't figured it out yet either, but they're good until forever. OJTSS, does anybody work with, I didn't hear anybody from civil rights here, but DBE, Disadvantaged Business Enterprises, and the on-the-job technical support services programs, those typically have no set year of availability to them. For things like the EDC that we talked about earlier, the research funds, those are typically available for a fiscal year plus 3. Why is this so important? Who can tell me? It takes a long time to finish a project. If my funds are good for 5 years, can I commit them or obligate them to something in year 6? No, can't use them. If I did, it was an ineligible cost. So period of availability is really important. And then the matching requirements we talked about, 80-20, 90-10, or 100%. All right, so here we get into some of the specifics of what these funds can be used for. The major program, NHPP, it provides funding to support condition and performance enhancement of the national highway system. So again, this can only be used on the national highway system. So as you're planning out your program and you're trying to decide what type of funding you're going to use, it's important to look at what your eligible and allowable activities are under those fund types so that you can make the best use of the money that you have. You can use construction and investment in the federal aid funds and highway construction that are directed to support progress toward achieving your goals, your performance targets. So this is bridges, tunnels, and highways on the NHS, so not off-system bridges. We talked about the STBG. This is the most flexible. So if you have something you're trying to do that may not be on the interstate system, that would be the type of funding you'd want to use. This was created under FAST Act, this STBG. It took a couple of other programs, correct me if I'm wrong, Bob, but it took a couple of other programs that we had and merged the money under one big block grant program that gave you the flexibility to decide what you wanted to use the funding for. It provides for bridges and tunnels on public roads of all classes. That's what's really important with this one. So you want to make sure that you're using the funds according to your needs. CMAQ. The purpose of the CMAQ is to reduce congestion, improve air quality, and then designed to help you meet your metropolitan areas meet their Clean Air Act obligations. So this one is another one, has very specific uses. If you don't have a program, then you wouldn't be able to use these funds. So it sounds like, but you do here have a small one. And I want to point out on all of the slides that you see at the bottom of your slide, Bob has put the reference to where you can find it in law. So as we move forward here, this one is defined under 23 USC 149. As we move into the 2 CFR 200 at the bottom of the slide, in case you have a question or want to refer back later, he's given you the exact part of the law that, or of where you can find it. HSIP. HSIP, of course, our main mission, and I'm sure yours is too, safety is number one. So these funds can be used to reduce pretty much anything that's focused on reducing traffic fatalities and injuries. But it does require a state highway safety plan. National Highway Freight Program. So you have to have a freight plan after 2 years of enactment of the FAST Act. I'm assuming you probably do, especially with all the performance measures, and then provides funding for the improvement and efficient movement of the freight. And metropolitan planning, I heard you say you have 4 MPOs, so that's the funding that they would get there. And typically, Federal Highway, FTA, we have a joint program oversight on this one. So interestingly with this one though, the money for the metropolitan planning funds, or the planning funds, they can move between Federal Highway and FTA back and forth, but they take on the color of the agency that they reside with, if that makes sense. The rules for how you're going to use them are going to follow FTA rules if it's FTA giving you the funds, or Federal Highway if it's a Federal Highway giving you the funds, and vice versa. All right, so we've talked a little bit about eligible and allowable. As we go through, this is so important because as I was saying, if you are using a certain type of funding, for example, a great example of this is on-the-job technical support services program. I know your civil rights people aren't here, but they put together a plan every year to do training in the summer, National Summer Transportation Institute, NSTI. It's geared to helping develop skills in younger teenagers, young adults, transportation-related skills. It is a summer program that runs from June to August typically. Unfortunately, in the last few years, Federal Highway has not been able to give their funding out until August in some cases. So it makes it really hard to run a program from June to August if you don't have the money until August. So we have to look at what is allowable costs and eligible activities. You could have an eligible activity. You could run your entire program, your whole NSTI program. Those are allowable costs, but they're not eligible if you don't have the federal funding or AC'd your project. Are you following my example?
Say it one more time.
Okay, so you have a National Summer Transportation Institute. You're running it. You're standing, am I? Okay. I was like, wait. Bob is the expert, so I will defer to Bob 100% in anything I say. But so your National Summer Transportation Institute runs June to August typically. If Federal Highway doesn't give you the money until August for that June to August activity, the program is defined. You've set your program, you've set your parameters. The costs under there are eligible to be reimbursed by Federal Highway. Sorry, they're allowable under Federal Highway's funding. It's exactly what the program was set up for. But if you don't have an assigned agreement with either the federal funds on it or have AC'd, advanced construction, your program, the funds aren't eligible. So they're allowable, but not eligible. Do you see the difference? You're still looking at me with a very puzzled face. It's okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm just going to chime in really fast because the big thing with, unfortunately, I got to use this thing so they can record it. So the big thing to remember is when we're authorizing a project, we're determining eligibility when we're authorizing a project. No costs have come in yet, right? So eligibility always happens first. And if you look at the law, which I'll pull up the USC here in a minute, for a program, let's say STBG, it's going to say these are all of the eligible activities that you can use your STBG funds for. Or like in Laura's example, the discretionary program for the Summer Transportation Institute, it's very, very specific in the law that says these are the things that you can use these funds for. And those are going to be the eligible activities, and that always happens first. We always determine eligibility first, and then the costs, when they come in, are when we're going to identify if a cost is allowable. So eligibility is always first, and we're doing it based on the activity. So very simple, a construction project. We're going to authorize construction on an NHS route, on a National Highway System route, and we're going to use NHPP funds. If we go to the section of the law under NHPP and say, okay, we want to do reconstruction on this interstate, on the NHS, it very specifically says, yes, construction activity is an eligible activity for NHPP as long as it's on the NHS, because that's one of the eligible things that you have to follow, is the funds have to be used on an eligible roadway. So when we're talking about eligible, we're talking about eligible location, which Laura already talked about earlier, functional classification, and we're also talking about eligible activities. Then, when the costs start rolling in and you're building that road, and you're getting, say, a contractor payment in or materials that we're paying for, then at that time we're going to say, okay, is that cost allowable? Because now it's a true cost. We're not just authorizing the activity, what you're going to do. Now the costs are coming in, and now we have to determine, is it an allowable cost? So then you want to look and say, okay, is it allowable? First thing you check is it an activity that's allowable under the law? Most of the time, if we're talking construction, we'll say, okay, that's right. Then you want to go even further into allowability and say, okay, was it authorized? Did an engineer sign off on it in the field? If an engineer didn't sign off on it, we would determine that be an unallowable cost because it wasn't authorized. So even though it could possibly be an allowable cost and an eligible cost, if certain things don't happen, like we don't have supporting documentation, we don't have an authorized signature for that item, they could become or be unallowable. So just remember on eligibility and allowability, eligibility is based on the activity and location. That's usually done up front at the very beginning. And then costs, determining if a cost is allowable, is going to be based on once the costs are incurred and the invoice comes across your desk or the time card, your engineers sign off on a time card and they're allocating their time to a project, did that person's supervisor sign off on the time card? If they did, then that would be an allowable cost. If a person signs their time card and it goes to the project and we get billed and no supervisor ever reviewed that time card or never signed off on it, we could come back and say that's an unallowable cost because it was not authorized. So that's the thing you have to think about, and that's why it says activities versus cost, because cost doesn't happen until way later. Activities happen at the very beginning. We have to determine eligible activities when we're authorizing the project before costs even happen.
Thank you. I think I did say that backward. I apologize. Yeah, that's one you can use now. All right. Any questions for Bob on that? I'll defer to Bob, because it was my fault. Thank you for questioning me. I had that backward in my brain. I don't know what was going on. So thank you for questioning that. Any questions on that for Bob? Do I see a hand back there? Okay. Okay. Do you want your microphone?
So I'm just going to pull up the oh yeah.
It's not on. Hold on, I'll get it for you. Okay.
Okay. So this is not an official a federal highway official page. This is where I usually go. It's the Cornell Law School. Now, you can go out and find the United States Code on the government pages, but this one, you know, and it's not a promotion from Federal Highway, it's just the one I use. But if you go to law.cornell.edu and go to the U.S. Code /text, here are all of the laws out there, all of the United States codes. So we want to go to 23 for highways. So if you're dealing with other federal dollars, this is where you would go to look up like other funding or other laws that you might have. So primarily, most of the stuff that we're going to talk about over the next couple days is in Chapter 1. Chapter 2 does have all of our federal lands. So I know in Oklahoma, you guys probably might be using FLAP funds, Federal Lands Access Program funds. That's where you would find that here in 204. Every state, most states have rec trails. This is where you find rec trails is in Chapter 2. But we're going to look at Chapter 1 really fast, because this is where most all of the programs that Laura just went through are located. So let's just jump down here to 133. This is our most flexible funding, Surface Transportation Block Grant. And there are easier ways to look this stuff up. We have fact sheets out on our Federal Highway website where you could actually go to the FAST Act, go to the fact sheets, and they'll give you a summarization of all of this stuff. But if you want to actually find it out in the law, here it is. So you can see right here in paragraph B, these are all of the eligible projects or activities that you can use STBG funds for. And so it's a long list for STBG because this is our most flexible. For the most part, you can use STBG funds for any activity that's eligible under our other major programs. So if you want to do HSIP or safety activities, you could use STBG funds for those activities. You know, why would you do that? Probably you wouldn't, because you have dedicated funds for it, but basically anything is eligible basically for STBG. So you can see here's all of our construction. So it lists all the different types of construction that can happen. Then we have operational improvements, we have environmental, we have highway and transit improvements, we have fringe and corridor parking facilities, rec trails projects are eligible for STBG, planning, asset management plans, protection including painting, scour, countermeasures, seismic, retrofits, etc. So you can see, I'm not going to read through them all, but there's a long list. And then here's our location. So remember, eligible activity and eligible location. This tells you where can we use our STBG funds. They can be used pretty much on any roadway classified higher than a local or rural minor collector. So if remember, Laura mentioned that what we consider eligible roadways are anything classified higher than a local or rural minor collector, and we have some exceptions to those rules like safety. Safety can be used on local roads or rural minor collectors. We also have a very specific pot of money called off-system bridge that's very specifically supposed to be used for bridges, you know, on those local and rural minor collector roadways. But for the most part, this tells you our locations and all of our activities, and that's just for STBG. So you would have to go out and look for What are the eligible activities for NHPP? What are the eligible activities for CMAQ? And you can go into each of those sections and it'll tell you what those activities are. And that's what we use when we're signing off on projects in the division office to make sure that, hey, the activities that you want to use or the activity that you want to do on this project using these funds, we have to make sure that we're determining that those funds are eligible at the very, very beginning before you even start incurring costs. Then when costs come in, then we're going to be doing that allowable, unallowable cost check. And it's really not going to be the division office that does that. That's going to be the state DOT. For the most part, you all, whoever's processing those payments or the folks out in the field, that's why it's really important that, you know, non-finance people understand the importance of this, because if you're supervising an engineer, it is very imperative that you sign off on their time cards, that there is a check. If, you know, a lot of times you might have engineering diaries where you're going out and you're verifying that the contractor delivered materials to a project, you're going to jot that down in your diary, whether it's still using the book or they have the handheld diaries now, but that's going to be the supporting documentation that supports not just the progress payment that comes in, but that's going to support that progress payment as that engineer's diary. And we would use that to determine allowability. When we go out and do a billing review, we're going to pull those diaries. We're going to pull Buy America certifications. We're going to pull a lot of different things to determine if projects are going to be allowable or not. But it should be happening at the state DOT first. You should be doing those checks first to make sure when you are billing Federal Highway for those costs that, you know, they're not going to come back and bite you later because maybe you didn't have a signature or maybe you didn't have your Buy America certification, because eventually we're probably going to see that when we do our billing transaction reviews or improper payment reviews. So that just gives you an idea of where you can go out and find the eligible activities and eligible locations for each of those programs.
Thanks, Bob. Any questions? That was a lot that he just said in a very short period of time.
Is that website where you would find the most up-to-date code books and things?
Yeah, the Cornell Law School, they do really good at keeping those up to date. But the official, I do have to say, the official is you have to go to the GPO, which is the Governmental Printing Office, has a web page that has the actual governmental U.S. code, but for the most part, we don't update the U.S. code except for when we get new legislation. So basically, you know, once the FAST Act comes out, you know, when the FAST Act came out, they had to go out and they updated the 23 USC, and then once they've updated it, it pretty much stays the same and doesn't change through the life of the legislation. So like, you know, as Laura mentioned, we're expiring, FAST Act expires this year on September 30th, and on October 1st, we need to either have an extension to continue to do business or a new legislation. So I would say it probably takes 6 to 9 months for them to update that once we get new legislation. So the Cornell Law School website and even the GPO website will probably be out of date until they can get the law codified on the web pages. But once it's in there, it pretty much stays the same and is a pretty good tool. The only reason why I use Cornell Law School is it has a lot better search functionality than the government one. You have to like really drill down in the government one. It's a lot harder to find stuff.
Thanks, I lost my clicker. All right, so now going back a little bit, we're going to talk about budget authority. Most programs in the federal government, as we talked about, have an appropriated budget authority that requires 2 acts of Congress: the authorization and the appropriation. The nice thing about Federal Highway, as we talked about going back to contract authority, is that we have most of our programs operate under the contract authority, and the authorized amounts are already established in the legislation. We don't have to wait for an appropriation every year for most of our programs. That's why even when there's a government shutdown, you can continue operating. But it does require, as we talked about, the provision in law. Here you can see it's 23 U.S.C. 118A, and we have to receive 90% or more of the funding from the trust fund. I'm sure many of you have heard conversation about the trust fund and the fact that the funding going into the trust fund isn't keeping up with expenses and needs outside, so we do get some money in from the general fund, but 90% of it comes from the Highway Trust Fund. So, purpose of the Appropriations Act, it funds the appropriated budget authority programs. It sets our annual obligation limitation, and I think it's the next module we'll get into obligation limitation and what that means, but it sets the annual limitation for our contract authority, and it sets our annual limitation for administrative funding, and it also appropriates an amount of liquidating cash from the trust fund to pay for your eligible expenses. All right, so now, Kahoot time again. Let's see how well I did in executing. You guys get to have fun, and it tells me how well I did in providing the information.
So we have 5 questions. First question, how many years does the FAST Act authorize the Federal Aid Highway Program? Yeah, 5. So 2016 through 2020. So 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. 5 years. All right, let's get fiscal. Is number 1, Bobby. Number 2. All right, good job. Here we go. Number 2, which of the following is a characteristic of the Federal Aid Highway Program? Read careful. I forgot to say read careful right before. Yeah, so that one's a kind of a tricky one. I'm going to maybe redo that one because we usually see issues. So it's federally assisted, state administered. If you put federally administered, state assisted, 16 folks said that. It's pretty close, but no, it's the feds, we just assist. You all do most of the work. You guys, conceive, design, construct everything. And Donut moved up. Bobby's still number 2. Lucky's still up in there. Carl 2. And let's get fiscal. Drop down to number 5. And Simon Cody's the highest climber. All right, number 3. Which of the following types of roadways are generally not eligible for federal aid funding? Yeah, local and rural minor collectors are generally, and we say generally because we always have exceptions to the rules, so like Laura said, our safety funds, they can be used on local rural minor collector roads. We have off-system bridge funds that are allowed, but for the most part, we want to only do roads, and the reason why, if we remember from functional classification, it's because the federal government, we're more concerned about those roadways that provide the most mobility. That's why you get your biggest pot of money is NHPP funds, is because we want, and our focus is primarily the NHS routes. All right. Carl 2. Moving up the line. Bobby's still sitting there, number 2. And Moneyman, highest climber. Okay, number 4. Select a program with the most eligible activities among all federal aid programs. Yeah, STBG. So the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, that basically, and that's the one that I pulled up on in the USC, that's the most flexible pot of funds that we have. For the most part, any activity in the federal aid program you can use STBG funds for. Oh, Matt Plantine pushed Bobby down to number 3. Carl 2's number up there, still up there. Oh yeah, on fire. Okay, here's the last question. If Congress does not pass an Appropriations Act or continuing resolution, federal highway will shut down. True or false? False. So, what do we need in order to stay open for business? What does federal highway need? An Authorization Act. So we have 2 different legislative acts. We have authorizations and we have appropriations. So authorizations we absolutely need. If Congress doesn't pass either an authorization or an extension to our authorization, we will shut down. But appropriations, which are done every year, annually, every October, if Congress doesn't pass appropriations, then it doesn't really impact us. We can still come into work. But if you remember last year in 2018 in December, when Congress didn't pass appropriations for like almost the entire month of January, the whole government shut down, but we could still come into work because we had an authorization, and so we did not need that Appropriations Act to come into work because we already have our authorization. But all the other federal agencies that don't have contract authority like we do, they do shut down because they have to have 2 legislative acts, the authorization and appropriations, in order to be open for business. Okay, who's the winners? Number 3, Matt Plantine. Number 2, Carl 2. Number 1,